Greetings, everyone. Welcome. So good to have you. I am Amy Antonucci with New Hampshire Peace Action, and I'm going to get us started tonight. I'm really glad to welcome you to a discussion of The Answers Are There, Building Peace from the Inside Out, with author Libby Hoffman here with us on April 18th, 2023. First, I want to let you know that for over 40 years, New Hampshire Peace Action has been educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all, based on cooperation instead of competition, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. In that spirit of respect, we'd like to start with an acknowledgement that we are doing our work on Nidakina, the traditional ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people. We honor with gratitude the land and the waterways and the people who have been in relationship here on Nidakina throughout the generations and continue that relationship now as well. Tonight, we welcome Libby Hoffman. Libby has worked for more than 30 years at the nexus of international peace building, organizational development, spirituality, and social transformation. She is the president of Catalyst for Peace, a private foundation she established in 2003 to grow a new architecture for peace, one that works from the inside out, where the people who are most impacted by war lead in building peace and restoring wholeness. For over 15 years, Libby has focused her work in Sierra Leone, first with the post-war reconciliation program, and then in a response to the 2014 Ebola epidemic. So tonight, she's going to start by telling us a little bit about her work to catch up those who haven't yet read the book and to begin the conversation. Then we're going to have question and answer and discussion. Remember that we love it when you keep your video on, but ask that you have your audio muted when you're not the one talking. You can use the chat for questions, and later, pretty soon, we'll be allowing you to raise your hand and speak as well. But for the moment, if you could just welcome Libby with me, let's do some kind of visible, yay, welcome Libby, we're so glad to have you. And I'm going to hand it to her.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. And thanks to all of you, both who are here with us live and who might be catching this later. It's a gift. There are a few things I like to do more than talk about my book and the ideas in it, and to engage with others who either have already read the ideas. Meg, read the book. You were not only have done that, but talked with others about it, which is great. The pumps are primed. Or for those who haven't, but are committed to being leaders in their own way in making our world a more peaceful and whole world. So this is a gift, and I just want to thank New Hampshire Peace Action for offering me the gift of this chance to talk with you. Some of you have read the book and some of you haven't. I want to just share a couple of stories and then open it for questions and answers. And Amy will, I think, help to invite out whether more stories or more ideas to help seed our conversation. But what I'm most interested in is engaging with you, the questions that you all have, and speak to the kinds of things that you're most interested in. I want to start. I've had this really priceless gift of being able to work in Sierra Leone for the last 15 years. And I think any kind of a long-term partnership in one area, first of all, is in and of itself a gift. And this particular partnership has been one that's borne just really bountiful fruit. And I've had the chance to accompany the growth. For those of you who don't know, Sierra Leone had an 11-year civil war that sort of set new standards for wartime atrocities. Especially, it was known for mass amputations as a tool of war, child soldiers, and the widespread rape and abuse and sexual atrocities committed to women. Over 250,000 women suffered at the hands, suffered some sort of sexual atrocity at the hands of the war. I mean, during the war. And the country was devastated. After the war, there was a special court that was a sort of a hybrid national and international court where the 13 men deemed most responsible for the war were prosecuted. It cost $500 million and led to 9 convictions. And some people had died or were presumed dead in the process. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was modeled on South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that allowed people to at least begin to document some of the atrocities of the war. But again, the people that were most impacted by the war didn't have access to be able to participate in that. So you had a situation where a third of the country had been displaced, over 50,000 people had been killed, virtually the whole infrastructure of the country had been destroyed, and people were largely living next door to somebody who might have burned down their house or amputated their arm or killed their mother or raped them or forced them to harm another, and they've never talked about it. I was able to partner with a longtime Sierra Leone human rights activist, John Cocker, who had been leading the charge both for human rights during the war and throughout the war for a call for a reconciliation process. And he had been calling for that process to be located at the community level, and nobody had listened to him. Everyone said, it's never been done that way. We can't work that way. And when he and I met, and I can tell you more about that story if you'd like, basically, we just realized we both shared this fundamental conviction that the people in communities most devastated by the war were the ones that had the most resources for addressing the challenges that they faced. And in my work in peace building, I had seen a lot of good work that happened at the local level, but most of it was isolated and episodic. Very little of it was long-term and strategic. And a lot of that I noticed was because of the funding structures. Funding structures and the whole sort of philanthropic system, a humanitarian aid system, really privileged pre-designed projects with visible outcomes. And with limited timeframes. And can you imagine if you were a general in an army and you had to fundraise for every battle you wanted to fight? I mean, you would never want to be a soldier in that kind of an army. And the peace building field has largely been defined in that kind of fragmented way. And one of the results of it is that the very resources that have the most potential to powerfully heal after war, to build peace and to lead in development are left out of the process altogether. And so John and I began working together to create a program rooted in this fundamental idea. It's the title of the book, The Answers Are There. And the people and communities most devastated are the ones that should lead in this process, not left on their own, that they need to be well supported by those at every level outside of the places where they are. And we wanted to figure out what are the systems that support us in doing that? Not just how do we do that in a few communities, which is good and important, but we wanted to figure out what are the systems that support that? How do we have a locally led process that's done at a national scale? And we knew with holding that vision, we would live into it and learn as we go. And one of the dynamics, so I run a private foundation. We were both a granting and an operating foundation, and we were funding the work of the program that became Fambul Tok, or Family Talk, which is Creole for Family Talk. And it's an ancient tradition that we revived for this work of helping the communities heal from war. This is a very alive tradition in Sierra Leone of solving problems through conversation with the family. And of course, they define family in much more than the biological sense. It's really your whole community and even your whole country. And so they had a tradition of talking around the bonfire at night and solving problems that way. And my colleague John and his staff revived that process for healing from the wounds of war, and created a reconciliation program that was rooted at the community level, inviting the villagers to come together to plan their own ceremony, and to revive this tradition of having a ceremony of truth-telling and apology and forgiveness around the bonfires in the very communities where the people suffered these devastations. And then drawing on their tradition to begin a process of whether it was ceremonial cleansing or some other ceremonial process like that, and then to begin to rebuild as a community, to re-knit the social fabric of the community so that they could work together going forward. And let me just tell one story, and then I will I'll open it up to see where you guys want to take it. I'm happy to talk about whatever is most interesting. One of the places I write about in the book is a village called Dabu. And Dabu was a rebel stronghold. And it's in the far eastern part of Sierra Leone in Kailam district. And because it had been a rebel stronghold, when the rebels invaded, half the town fled and went to live other places. And the people who stayed after the war ended, it was all assumed that they were either rebels or rebel collaborators. So after the war, when people moved back, they were living next door to people that either did hurt them or a family member, or who they suspected of doing so, or of helping the people who did. And so the town was divided, and this is a pattern that replicated itself across all of Sierra Leone. And if there was a town meeting, besides the fact that the town community center where people gathered was burned down in the war, if there was a town meeting to gather, if I knew that you were the one who had killed my daughter, I wouldn't go to that meeting if you were going. And so unseen patterns like that kept perpetuating themselves, but add up to a recipe that village was never going to really recover from the war, coupled with the fact that the government said forgive and forget. And it was a recipe for never being able to develop. So the Fambul Tok bonfire that they held there, first of all, the Fambul Tok staff recruited from that area spent 2 to 3 months working with the community. They didn't plan the ceremony themselves. They worked with the community to plan it. And while they did it, they put in place community structures. They mobilized the youth to go around and tell everybody about it. And they established a community of the people a committee of the people the community designated as elders or trusted people. They weren't all old or elders officially, but they were trusted people from all the different groups, victims and perpetrators, men and women, Muslim and Christian, youth and elderly. All of those groups were represented. Those were the people that helped to plan and run the ceremony. And then they were in place to be like a community trusted circle of care. When there were problems that came up afterwards, people could go to them and ask them to help them solve those problems. In addition, they planned a whole series of follow-up activities. The ceremony itself was not the end of the process, but the beginning. And by reestablishing those community bonds, the community members could lead in activities, whether they were recreational, like soccer matches, or collective farming, and work together side by side in ways that normalized the repaired relationships. And there's just one story in particular, and again, this is one I write about in the book, and I find it powerful in a number of ways. Michael and Mariama lived next door to each other in the village of Dabu, which I didn't actually know until after the bonfire ceremony. And in the war, Michael had been conscripted by the rebels. And when the village of Dabu knew that the rebels were coming, everybody fled, including Mariama and her family. Everybody in her family escaped, and they all buried their food or any valuables that they had before they fled. Their 7-year-old daughter did not, and was captured by the rebels, who came, and they were looking for food, and they tried to get the girl to tell where the food was, and she wouldn't. They tied her to a chair and beat her to try to get her to tell, and she wouldn't, and they beat her ultimately until she died. And now, fast forward several years, Mariama's family is back living next door to Michael. They never talked about what happened. They literally live next door in a village where if you stand in a certain places, you can see all of the houses in that community. There's no escape. And in the bonfire ceremony, which the chief from the community opened with words about why this was a safe space, inviting people to tell what happened to them or what they did, to get it off their chest in front of the community, and that there would be no punishment for what happened. And after this ceremonial opening, accompanied by, of course, the music and the dancing, and but as the fire grew, Michael was the first one to step forward. He was so eager, and he explained what had happened, and said that he'd been carrying this weight and he wanted to apologize. And the facilitator asked, well, is the woman whose daughter he killed here? Mariama stepped right up and stepped into the bonfire. And Michael went over, and in Sierra Leone, they have a ceremonial bow. When you are asking for forgiveness, you bow. You kneel at somebody, and so that your head is showing. And Mariama touched his head, which is the symbolic gesture of I forgive you. And she said, I forgive you. And he stood up, and right away they embraced and linked arms and walked out of the bonfire, and the community began singing and dancing. Now that sounds incredible. And that was actually one of only, I would say, 10 or so testimonies that night. All equally compelling. But the next morning we found out that Mariama lived next door. And so this was especially poignant. And that one of the most powerful messages, and I love when I get to tell the story visually, because her response was visible. You know, we filmed the work and made a feature film of Fambul Tok. And so we're filming during the first year and a half of the program. And so we were there with the film director and the film crew, and interviewed Michael and Mariama the day after the ceremony, knowing that for an American audience, they wouldn't believe that kind of forgiveness was possible. Like they would think it was planned or faked or coerced. And so our director, Sarah Terry, asked Mariama, you know, did somebody tell you to, like, did you really mean that, or did somebody tell you to like, is that just what you're supposed to do? And Mariam immediately just sat back and looked at Sarah like annoyed. And she's like, first of all, she said, we can think for ourselves on these things, which I thought was a great line and is a fundamentally foundational belief, actually, that grounded the way we structured and ran the whole program. But Sarah asked her to explain a little bit how she could. And she said, you know, first of all, they were forgiving because they needed to move on and to develop, and they knew they couldn't without peace. And she said, before, and she had her hands up here, I carried the burden of my daughter's death by myself. And then she moved her arms like this, and she said, now my whole community carries it with me. That bonfire didn't bring her daughter back. And when she forgave Michael, she hadn't even fully experienced the wholeness of the community that would be further reinforced in the months to come. But given the fact that they had worked together themselves, they had been repairing those bonds already in the lead up to this, and it was happening in front of her community. She knew that community would make sure Michael wouldn't hurt her or anybody else again, and that if she had a need, that they would help him. And she knew, Michael knew, and the whole community knew that having to acknowledge what you've done in front of the community is probably one of the worst punishments that they could suffer. That naming and shaming is punishment in that Sierra Leonean culture. Now, this was one ceremony that took 2 to 3 months to prepare, and months, if not years, actually, of follow-up that was launched through that process. It's a way of working that embeds an arc of time and builds structure right into it. And that was one of over 250 of these reconciliation ceremonies that Fambul Tok held in over 6 of Sierra Leone, at the time 14 districts. And so we were working to build this out at a national scale. And I can talk more about how we did that and the lessons and sort of both the theory that came from that, and then some of my own learning as the outsider that was supporting that. But one of the reasons that I wrote the book wasn't just to tell the stories of Fambul Tok. We've told those stories. We made a feature documentary film. We wrote a book about Fambul Tok, but it's really to illuminate what is the system that supports people in communities leading. And I think the fundamental 2 things I'll say, and then I'll open it up. One is that we have this, and we've seen this over and over. People are capable of incredible things. And healing and repair happens in community. And incredible potential is unleashed in community. And so dedicating our work to the process work of rebuilding the community and creating space for people to lead, that was the focus of the program. And one of the challenges with program design and with funding is we were not funding a building or a school or things that were visible. We were funding process. And that's people and cars and gasoline and time. Process was our product. And that's working counter to, but strategic process, linked process that builds over time. And one of the things that requires, John and his staff was accompanying the villages. I was accompanying John and his staff, and we were building structures of accompaniment at every level so that the communities could learn, they could come together and decide. The staff could learn, they could come together from different areas, reflect on what they had been learning, build that into the program design. John and the senior leadership and we could do the same thing. And then we could mirror those stories back to them through film and other storytelling mechanisms in ways that help to magnify that potential. So there's really important roles for an outsider if you want to do this work in long-term strategic and sustainable ways and ultimately make the impact. You have to work from the inside out. Both inside and outside are needed, and they're in different kind of relationship. It's a mutual relationship. So all of that, including my journey and all of nothing about the way I worked is really anything that I was trained in any of my professional training in international relations. Some of my other extra training outside of my professional training, yes, but it's required a consistent unlearning as much as a learning. And I think we all have to always bring our learning into our work. And from the perspective of an outsider and a funder in particular, but at the international level and as a white American, that's another thing that I would just offer is that when we come in as a learner, then and really willing to learn and to build on our learning, then that actually supports a space of transformation. That offers more than coming in as a knower or a doer or a fixer does. And I've seen that happen over and over. So much is possible when we create a space and offer an invitation and support and accompaniment for people and communities. And that's what I've experienced and why I was so thrilled to write the book and to be able to talk with you guys about it. So I'll stop and Amy, turn it over to you to see if there are things you would like me to jump in response to or open it up for others, however you want to go forward.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a really beautiful opening. I have to say, one of the things that I do love in this book are the stories. I mean, it really is kind of a series of stories, whether stories from around the fire, your own stories, which made it a really, it went fast. I do want to say a few things, and I also am expecting that other folks here will have questions. But there are a few things that really stood out to me. First, really, the stories are so inspiring, and really what seemed to me is that it's kind of like you're saying, I had such a sense that they have so much to teach us, that it is so inspiring to see people, they're kind of showing us what we're capable of. Because I really believe if anyone, if a human has done it, all humans can do it. And this sort of depth of forgiveness, of healing that they are doing is just so beautiful. And I love that. And we might get a little more into that, but what I think I'd like to start with, because I think it is kind of fundamental to what you're to sort of setting the stage here. One thing you talked about in the book was that often aid and development and assistance is really just an extension of colonization. That these things are often, the way they play out is much less helpful to communities than it is another way to colonize them. Yeah. And that you really worked to change that. And I would love to have you speak a little bit to that. Some of the things that stood out to me was trying to break down, for instance, the barrier between givers and needy. Yeah. To shift it to understand everyone has something to contribute. So that piece really stood out to me. Also, the idea of hierarchy, whether you're talking about top down or bottom up, you're still living within a hierarchical structure, and that you really wanted to shift that. So those are a couple pieces, but essentially the work that you are doing to have this be truly an accompaniment process versus more of a colonial structure. Can you speak a little to that?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a great question, a huge question. And I think we could spend hours and days actually on that. And I'm sure you guys have lots of experiences to share, stories from your own experience to share. So first of all, I think it's neocolonial largely because, the aid infrastructure was established by the colonial powers, right? The international system was largely established by colonial powers. So of course it's going to reflect that legacy. I don't think that there's an intentionality around a desire to colonize or control, but it's baked into the structures that are there. And one of the things and one of the most basic ways that it shows up is, and I'll actually use that as an opportunity to share the visual example that I love to share. First of all, aid is so often individualized, and we don't even see the community itself that where the need is taking place. So let me just share this example. So if you think about, and I write about this in the book, but I think showing it will be helpful. If you think about the community that has the challenge that you're addressing, and so in this case, it was post-war reconciliation or lack of reconciliation, but it could be lack of development or healthcare needs or education needs or gender issues, whatever it is. The aid, in the aid system as it is, the aid is like this bottle of water. And the perspective is if we just pour the bottle of water in to the community, give it aid, pour the bottle of water in, that will meet the need. But it doesn't. Why? Because, the water goes right through because the community itself is cracked. Now, in the aid system, the community itself is invisible. We don't see the community itself. We see the problem. We see the people who have the problem, but not the community. But as a result, like if it doesn't solve the problem, you just pour more water in. But oftentimes, the more water you pour in without addressing those cracks, it just makes the cracks wider. It leaves people in communities worse off, feeling and more distrustful of the outside. It's just not good for those that are providing aid either, right? It just depletes them. So it's a system that's not really working for anybody. But when you make the community, and Fambul Tok was not an organization that poured water in. They didn't go give money to the communities. They repaired the cracks in the cup. And so that's one of the ways colonialism shows up is the community is invisible in the aid system. The work of repairing the cup is invisible. The only work that's visible is the work that's pouring the water in. And in that definition of the system, this is by definition where the need is. This is by definition where the resources are. And the directionality, it flows one way. There is, within that conceptualization of the system, there's no possibility for, so it's a dichotomization of resource and need. And that's a mindset as much as anything, but it gets implemented in all sorts of practices, both positive practices and the things that aren't done. And so Fambul Tok's work was about repairing the cup. And one of the things that we found is that when you repair the cup, first of all, obviously then the community itself can hold the aid. But what happens is it's actually that cup, here's the repaired cup, it becomes actually like a well. And it can tap into the deep reserves of groundwater underneath without even needing the outside aid. And so the communities, once you invited them to organize and to lead their own process, what they started doing, the Peace Mothers are an incredible example of this. They started leading programs on behalf of their community, and building schools and building community centers and sending kids to school, paying school fees, coming together to address the social needs, whether it's teenage pregnancy or whatever it is. And growing that beyond just their village into regional levels also, and then building up the political power, leadership power of women, formal and informal, in their communities. And so these communities, repaired communities, become a source of incredible energy. And I think now it's not one way. If the community is visible in Fambul Tok's process, so here you have a collection of villages. It's a section. That work was supported by Fambul Tok at the chiefdom level. Chiefdom is like counties in the United States. So, but there's a chiefdom bowl too, how things are organized at the chiefdom that's inside there. And then that was aggregated to the district level, which is like states for us. And then that was aggregated and supported at the national level. And so Fambul Tok has been the civil society organization at the national level that's been holding the whole and working at it like this. And then that was supported at the international level, largely in the first several years by Catalyst for Peace, and now other funders, other organizations. And as the work grows at this level, the national level, the government, we've been working with the government, they've adopted this community mobilization process that's been adapted for planning and development now. They've adopted it as a national policy framework, and it's the basis of the whole national development plan and the local governance policy and process. So the national includes both government and civil society now. But this is the conceptualization of the system that we were working on. Now, you often hear about top down and bottom up. And people will say, oh, you're doing grassroots work, you're doing bottom up as opposed to top down. And I say, no, we're not. And I don't like that metaphor of top down and bottom up because it's still a hierarchy. And this is the image that we've been working within, is that there are different sectors, there are different levels. They each have different needs, they each have different resources, they each have different capacities, they each have different roles, but they're all working together in part of the whole system. And in a system of nested, and they're communal entities also that need to work together. And so there needs to be collaborative capacity across each bowl, not just at the local level, but collaborative capacity. Right now, the hardest thing to build collaboration between is the different ministries in the government, the Ministry of Local Government and the Ministry of Planning. Like, wow, getting them to think outside their own silos is hard work. But it has to happen, and building linkages between government and civil society too. And so this is the image. Now there's no top, you could be in the international level, you could be the UN and be up here or down at the bottom, depending on where you are in this. But in this conceptualization of the international system, the role of each bowl is to hold, to facilitate the repair of the bowl inside it, to facilitate leadership in addressing it, to hold the space for it, to bring out the learning, to connect it to the level outside so that you make sure that what's happening, the needs here are reflected out here, to share the stories out here, to share the inspiration, to bring in the learning at each level. So there's important roles for the outsider. It's just not one-dimensional. And the flow is from the inside out. And, you know, my book is really an example of bringing knowledge and learning from this process out to the international level, right? Like that's one way of bringing a flow out. And this vision of the system allows for a completely different way of working, and it allows for different, it allows for the process work of repairing the bowls, of repairing the cups to be more visible. So this is the alternative mindset. And so how were we doing that? In lots of ways, right? I mean, it gets, and I can speak to some more of that, but one of the things that I think, if we talk about a learning and immersion design platform, if you're going to work in ways that put the people and communities impacted at the center of the process and invite them to name what they see as their main challenges and how they want to address them, it's going to be impossible to plan how that's going to go totally beforehand. You can't. You have to work in emergent ways. And this is true about anything in life, right? Like we have to respond to changes as they happen. And so one of the things at the next level out is to be observing what's happening, what issues are arising, and how are we going to address them? And that was one of the main functions that we had at the international level, was gathering people for times of reflection and then adapting the design based on it. It's a terrifically important role, a needed role in the international system. We hardly make space for it. And I think we can't have fundamental transformation without it. But it needs to be connected to program design in ways that allow you to have the program adapt to both needs and opportunities. And so we need to retrain ourselves, not to be coming in as the ones who are experts trying to fix, but the ones who are learners and accompaniers and facilitators. And those are the ways I think we've internalized a lot of colonial assumptions that we have to continually. And I would say one more thing about that, and this goes into, it's really relational work. It's really relational work. You have to work on relationship. You know, in my graduate education at the Fletcher School, like, did anybody ever say relationship is key? No, only if you were talking about leaders of countries and their relationships with each other, right? But so much time and work goes into building relationships. That's also where the power is. And one of the things that I think when you're working at local levels becomes so clear, local levels have so much power. They're closest to the issues. When they're leading, they have such powerful incentive. And the networks of care, localized networks of care, just care. I care for my neighbor. I have to, because my survival depends on them. But they're also family more broadly. And so these localized networks of care are largely invisible in a lot of the international system. And when we take them seriously and work to invest in animating them, and support that structurally and programmatically, it really unleashes, incredible power. So to be able to have care and power, and in the same sentence, is an alternative to legacies of colonialism, I would say.
Thank you. Meg, I saw you have a comment. Would you like to speak to that?
Oh, forgive me. I was being a little bit snarky, as I like to do. I am Meg Kinghorn, and I'm living in West Virginia, but I have worked in development for a long time and have been able to go to Sierra Leone as well. So I just couldn't avoid this opportunity to jump in. And I just think that the traditional system with the metaphor that Libby had of pouring the water in, it just instills the belief that the defects are with their container, not our water and the way we deliver it, and I think that's the paradigm that we need to shift. Our water is clean, or at least clear and abundant, and that's not where the defects are. It's with that side, and I think listening to Libby describe this new way of working sounds really nice. I would really just love to just bold it, highlight it, put little spinners around it. Really just fabulous. And just what an incredible model this is that she articulates so beautifully, that not only there's a role for everybody that's so important to play. If each level isn't there playing their part, it's not going to work. And so much of the discussion now is, well, what's the role that we have to play, particularly the international NGOs and international governments? Does this mean we walk away? No, the role is clear. It's no longer to be the center of the model, right, or the heroes of the model holding up the model. It's to be take your nested part supporting the successive things. And I also was thinking, and I was so glad you talked about relationship, because we focus on the bowls, and it's really about the relationship of the bowls to one another, to their other bowls, and to the different levels. If the bowls can't nest, it's not going to work too. So that to be in relationship is as key as the soundness of the bowl themselves. And one thing I wanted to note, Libby, in that model is that there is no individual bowl. The smallest bowl is the community, and that's really hard for us, I think, and for individual cultures, not really appreciating that in some ways there's not really an individual bowl in some communal cultures, and that how important that reconciliation was. I did read the book, and then I went and watched the movie, and of course the movie sticks because it's got the visuals, and that at the end, when you end with Mohammed Savage, it really is, he lived pretty savage life for a while, and he was saying, I have to reconcile with my people. For the last few years, I have done things, but I haven't really lived. Because he can't fully live if he's not in relationship with his community. And I think that's something that it's hard for us to really appreciate the importance of that, and how critical it was. And then perhaps how easy it is for that reconciliation process. Because it is, sometimes you watch those scenes in the movie and it's like, oh, that can't be real. It must be a reconstruction or something. And I think to really fully appreciate that it's so much more interdependence there than it is here. And so I'm just wondering, what is it that we could learn with our own reconciliation processes here in this country? What would that look like? We wouldn't have bonfires, but how could we reconcile and bring those principles here to this country? So said a lot, sorry.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. I really appreciate it. And I think it's a great question. I think you guys probably have more ideas than I do about how we can learn from that in this country. But it just speaks to, like, one of the reasons why I really wanted to weave my story in the book is because I think we need to take our own learning and transformation seriously also. And, in this work, especially from the position that I am, I have been continually tempted to just privilege my head. And I've had to learn how to really center my own heart or my gut. And that's played out in my leadership development. And I had to cultivate a community of support for me as a leader and as a person in order to move forward in the work. And I mean, ironically, that was one of the hardest things for me in order to move forward as a leader, to create space where I could actually receive support from others. It's hard to receive support. It's hard. I think it's hard in unique ways for women in particular, to receive praise in that way, and to structure it, into the process, I think is really hard. But fundamentally, I feel like we have to be present as people ourselves in this. Like, it's about making space for people. And I don't know if you remember, Meg, but in the end of the book, I do have an illustration from a story where it was clear that heart knowledge was really centered. The individual heart is in the center of here at some level. And so it is from the inside out as people too. And how do we bring our whole selves in the process? And what are the structures that allow us to do that? I think those are questions we can all ask, no matter what work we're doing. In what, in that sense, it's all peace building work and development work too, for that matter, I guess. But I think those are really, really important questions. And one of the questions I have, and I think this is something, it's a programmatic question as opposed to like a community question. But how do we use I think we're in this transition to a new system. And those of us who have access to financial resources have to figure out how to use those resources in ways that they unleash the most resource in the people and communities where we're working. And so how do we use, it's not that money isn't needed. How do we use it in ways that create those opportunities, even while we're in the middle of the transition, I think is just an important. And how do we align? There are so many more resources available, I think, than we even realize. How do we align resources with potential? And that might sound like an abstract question, but I think we each can find ourselves in that question in different ways. So.
And to recognize the different types of resources too, financial and social and mental and spiritual, and not just, it's all about the money. We get to dictate. It's so important.
Yeah.
You've both made such great points. I mean, I think in a way, the money is not the resource. It's the thing that creates, it helps move along the resources. At the end of the day, money is not like a real thing, right? It's just what moves other things along. That there's so many great points. It's really hard to, I did want to make a connection. One group that we've heard from is the Forgiveness Project. Which documents and talks about this sort of work happening all over. And actually, I kept thinking about this one story we heard from them when, I can't remember, I believe it was last fall that we had a presentation by some folks, and it was in this country, the United States, and it was a woman whose son had been shot by I think it was sort of like a gang situation in an inner city, and she ended up reconciling with the young man who killed her son and sort of adopting him as her own in a way. And so again, this isn't just this is a human thing that we just, how to help each other find that more often would be really useful. And I do want to actually highlight one thing I read that was really kind of mind-blowing to me, and yet made a lot of sense. There is a section where you talk about asking another person, I can't remember what his position was until I get to this. Yeah, so you were talking with Sheikh Musa Khalil.
Yeah.
And you asked, I think it's a him.
Yeah, it is.
What the biggest challenge to peace in their region was. Yeah. And he said the International Criminal Court.
Yeah,
And I want you to talk about that and the way that essentially what I got out of it, but then I want you to go into more detail, is that even though that seems like such a great idea and a thing I feel like we should support and the US should support, because we haven't yet. We like to talk about sending other people there, but we've never signed on to it. And yet at the same time, they had indigenous ways of coming to justice and dealing with these sorts of atrocities, and that they were actually being short-circuited by something that seems like such a great idea.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yes. Well, I would just say, I think an aspect of colonialism is what concepts we privilege and what concepts we invisibilize. And I've made invisibilize a verb. I don't know if it is, but it is in my vocabulary now, because it just happens all the time. So there's an assumption that justice is about separation and punishment. So first of all, and culturally, that is just not universal. And in Sierra Leone, the justice is, first of all, when you hurt somebody, you hurt the community. And you don't have justice until the community is made whole again. And that includes whoever was harmed, but it also includes the perpetrator. And so community wholeness as a definition of justice is, it's not punishment and separation necessarily. So first of all, that Sheikh Khalil is one of the founders of the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative in northern Uganda. And the backstory there is, the religious leaders can work at the community level in northern Uganda, or most places actually, and also at the highest levels with the government and the rebel leaders. And so they were acting as go-between between the highest levels of the government and Joseph Kony and the rebel leaders. And at a certain point, Joseph Kony had retreated far into the jungle in the Central African Republic and was nowhere to be found. And so but the religious leaders, Sheikh Khalil braved, he and a couple of his colleagues hiked through the jungle, through the woods, and there were circles of security around Joseph Kony, and they braved and nearly lost their life at each encounter with those circles of security. Finally reached Joseph Kony, were able to locate him, were able to find him, were able to meet with him, and they felt that they were close to saying, to getting him to come out of hiding and come back to face accountability for what he was doing. And they have a tradition in northern Uganda of offering forgiveness. In fact, I have a photograph out in the hall right out there of one community meeting where they brought people together in communities in northern Uganda and said, now, if Joseph Kony came here, how many of you would want him to come here and apologize to you? Everybody raised their hand. How many of you would forgive him if he apologized? Every hand was raised. So there's a picture of this whole huge community of people all with their hands raised, right? So this is the culture. So they felt that this culture of forgiveness would have brought Joseph Kony out of hiding for him to face accountability, their kind of accountability. They had just achieved that, had that meeting when the ICC, issued, indicted Joseph Kony. And so, of course, he slunk further into hiding, disappeared from visibility, refused to engage in it anymore. So they felt that they had lost this opportunity to engage in the kind of difficult truth-telling and apology and forgiveness that would have helped them bring a measure of accountability and move forward. And so the ICC, both by how it was defining justice and what it was rendering invisible, it was completely discounting the community's willingness and capacity and those ideas of forgiveness. Now, granted, they're difficult for us to understand, but why would we think that just our conceptions of justice are the only ones or the only right ones? And so that, it floored me. At the time that I heard that was like 2006 or something, it completely floored me. But, I think at the systemic level, right? So I'm thinking, okay, so here we have an international system that invisibilizes certain things. how do we actually live it out differently? And that became a motivating vision for me. Like, what would it look like to address the wounds of war from the concept of a system that actually took local cultural values and people and communities, not only took them seriously, but actually centered that and built around that. So his comment is really what unlocked my imagination that, oh, well, there could be a different way. Why not? Yeah. And exactly. And I think, to me, one of the things that shows, I have to check myself all the time. What am I imagining is possible? What am I imagining is possible? And am I imagining that the system as it is, or as I think it is inevitable, that it will always be that way? It's really tempting to do that. If I am, guess what? I'm letting the colonizer mind be my mind. I'm letting that imagination be my imagination. Adrienne Murray Brown talks about, whose imagination are we inhabiting? I don't want to inhabit that imagination. And the thing that this experience in Sierra Leone has taught me is so much more is possible. I mean, oh my gosh. I at every level, like, it's breathtaking what I have seen and witnessed, and I have to keep checking myself. What am I imagining is possible? Am I imagining that, oh, it always has to be that way? And that's another part of the inside out. Like, what mindset am I bringing? And how willing am I to challenge my own comfort areas? It's more comfortable to say it's always going to be that way. Because guess what? Then we don't have to hold ourselves responsible for doing it differently. It's a scapegoat. So let's open up our imaginations and invite, not in a see no evil, hear no evil kind of a way, but be willing to engage at that level too. I think it's a crisis of imagination as much as it is financial resources.
Thanks. That's great. I have, over the past few years, been really interested in reading about and learning more from indigenous cultures all over the world. And I have definitely seen, I was just reading a book about mostly Native American perspectives, and also did some reading on more ancient Ireland forms of justice from Brehon law.
Yeah.
And our kind of focus on punishment versus reintegration of people is actually new and different, and seems to have not been the way anyone was working for really which makes sense. Where are you gonna lock people up? It's just a really different sense. And you're right, we get caught in, there's so many things we feel like, well, it's this way because it has to be this way. It's inevitable. There's so many things that are actually brand new, even, things like capitalism and the nation state. And we feel like, well, that's how it is, but it's actually just here. So that's really a great perspective. I wanted to talk, oh gosh, there's so much I want to talk about, but I think what I'd like to ask next is for you to talk, one thing that we'd really like to, I've been learning more about and haven't gotten a lot of programming on yet, is the centering, the new information, let's call it, that the bringing in and sometimes centering of women in peace processes leads to a much better outcome.
Yeah.
Like the research is very compelling. And that is something that you very clearly did. And that was something that was pushing against the local culture, it seemed to me. And I wondered if you could talk about that piece of it, why it was so important to you, and how it has evolved.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So the founder and director of Fambul Tok, John Cocker, is a human rights advocate. So it comes from that human rights background. He was working for women's leadership, for women's rights. That's, core to who he is. And so those principles are embedded within the Fambul Tok program, and they're embedded within my perspective. Individually, from my perspective, one of the things that I loved about feminist theory was just this idea of taking the very people that have been left out of the system or the definition of the system and centering them and their experience. I think it opens up so much creativity. That was always a fascination for me, just as a little aside. John is, so in that work of repairing the cup, like the community container, the bringing the community together to plan everything and establishing local committees that stay there afterwards. Every committee that was established, every gathering, it was set up with equal numbers of men and women. Like that was just part of the principle that they would do that. And, at first we kind of thought, well, great, then that's how we do it. And in every meeting, you can't just have men and women. The women will be there and they won't speak. What the staff has found is that you have to, two things, like one, you have to invite them to speak directly, but you have to invite them not just once, but twice, and not just twice, but 3 times. And finally, in a community meet, like where you have invited them to speak, like at least 3 times, that's then where they will speak. So you have to have and actually one of the staff strategies, these are the little things that I get so excited about, that I nerd out about these little program details, but like the thing that they notice when they have a whole of community gathering, is that if the women are off on the side and they start talking with each other, they won't share something with the group. But if they start talking with each other, that means they have something to say. So that's when you ask them. So they train their staff to look for that. When you see women talking with each other, ask them what they want to say. Like those kinds of, like, these are the practical details that actually, this is how you get women's equal participation. Anyway, so with all of that, 6 months into Fambul Tok, the women were saying, this isn't enough, right? We suffered uniquely in the war, and we need more. We need space just for us. And so Fambul Tok did what it does, which is, so it said, well, what do you want? And it gathered women from all the places where it was working at the time and said, what do you want? And they came together and they said, we just want to place together as women. We want it to be non-political. They chose the name Peace Mothers because they didn't want it to have any kind of political significance. And all we want to do is to get together and work together for our community, which, first of all, when you got how they want to heal from the war is to come together and work together on behalf of their community. But coming together as leaders working on their community, first of all, it empowers their sense of, I am a leader with something important to contribute. Look what I can do for my community. And that's incredibly empowering. And then second of all, it's the informal time. When you're together with other women, those are the places that you can speak about the things that you can't talk with anybody else about, not even your husband. And so they wanted that informal space. It's not the formal, it's the informal space, the relational space, the networks of care at the local level. And they unleashed this incredible energy. So at the local level, there are community improvement organizations, one that's co-ed and one that's all women. But the Peace Mothers groups, like, they just took off. I mean, the energy that it unleashed, like, they planted community farms. And then with the money from that, they decided they wanted to pay school fees. And then they wanted to make a bigger farm. And then they talked to the women from the next town and pooled money to get a rice huller for their region so that they can hull more rice. And then they, so it just, like, one thing led to another. And sometimes there was resistance. Most of the Peace Mothers groups, they do everything communally, everything out in the open, any money that they gather. Every week when they meet from all the different villages, they each bring a small amount of money. And then they make a communal pot and they decide together how to do it. Most of the women aren't literate in the conventional Western sense of literate, and can't track the money. So they have men or boys or whoever might have that capacity help them. There are usually men involved in a support way in the Peace Mothers groups. And typically when there is resistance, it's not long lived. And we have heard so many stories, in particular of chiefs saying, that they resisted it. And then when they saw what the women were contributing to their community, any of the men actually, they were like, oh my gosh, we want more of this. Like, there is such desperate need, and there is such a recognition of help. So how can you not want something that's going to help pay the school fees or bring in food for your community? And the other thing is that these groups of women were so trusted in the local community that whenever there was another crisis, like election violence, they would mobilize the peace mothers and train them in messages of nonviolence, and utilize them to do violence prevention around the elections. Or Ebola prevention was a huge one. And they were more effective than any other group because they were trusted in their region. And when you work on behalf of your community and you're from that community, like, it just builds trust. And in the areas where Fambul Tok worked in the first part of the program and hasn't worked, the parts of the work that has stayed and been most vibrant are the peace mothers groups. Like, they're just going great guns without Fambul Tok coming back and checking on them at all. Women are getting elected to parliament. They're getting elected to chieftaincies in areas that are supporting that. They're, becoming district councilors. So taking on more formal political roles in those areas too. I mean, it's just, it's astonishing what they're able to do on behalf of their communities. And like, that potential was there before. It was just dormant. It was just dormant.
Beautiful. There are some really beautiful stories about this part, and I do like what you're saying, that often there was resistance, but that it was short-lived.
Yeah.
That it was, it wasn't insurmountable. It was just new and different, and not recognized what it could bring.
Yeah.
Another thing I'd love for you to talk about, there were, including the story. Oh, actually, I'm going to have Chris ask a question first, and then I'll come back. I have a ex-combatants question around that. But Chris, please ask a question.
Yeah, thank you. The willingness for the larger groups to recognize and see as legitimate the forgiveness and reconciliation that has gone on in the communities. Is that accepted at all levels in Sierra Leone, for instance? Or are there places that say, well, this is sort of a folksy kind of a way to resolve problems? But as you were saying with Joseph Kony and the International Community Court, the court really didn't want to recognize any effort other than their own.
Right. Well, first of all, in Sierra Leone, there is a culture of forgiveness. There is a tradition of, and I'll say one, there is a tradition of, when you acknowledge what you're wrongdoing, when you acknowledge in front of the community and apologize, that you are forgiven. Like, that is part of their culture. Their understanding of forgiveness, though, is not that that's the end of it. It's more that what you're agreeing to do is to work together from that point forward. That's really what forgiveness is in that context. And in the Sierra Leone context, Fambul Tok started after they had had a special court. They'd had this tribunal. The international community had spent $500 million on it. And virtually every Sierra Leonean that I've talked to will tell you the special court impacted them zero. Didn't impact them or their lives at all. They had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that lasted for over 2 years, and it produced a 4,000-page book documenting some of the atrocities, but it didn't actually foster reconciliation. They had the ceremonies of it, the testimony gathering in Freetown in the capital, and then in the capital cities of the different districts or states. And they had them over the course of like 5 days, with part of that as ceremonial and part of that as closed. So you had like a 1-day thing where there was an opportunity for public testimony in a district where some people have never left their village. They have no way of getting to the district capital city to participate. And that would mean days of lost income for, like, it's just, people didn't have access to participate. And the perpetrators didn't have incentive to testify because they had a blanket amnesty as a part of the peace accord that ended the war. So in Sierra Leone, Fambul Tok arose after those official processes had been tried. And the government had said, yeah, we need to reconcile, but there had been no support and no process for it. So it would be hard to say what would have happened if they had started the Fambul Tok process immediately after the war instead of a tribunal. I don't honestly know. My colleague John Cocker will say, absolutely, it should have been started then. It could have done, and it is embedded in the culture. And so, but you know, these are the kind of things that are impossible to say. Mohammed Savage, who was, you know, they indicted 13 men in Sierra Leone, and there's sort of it's common perspective that if they had indicted a 14th, it would have been Mohammed Savage. He was one of the most notorious warlords, mostly rebel commander, who had committed a ton of atrocities. And at first, when he wanted to testify, the special court proceedings were still going on. And there was a perception that if he testified, he actually would be held accountable, could be prosecuted by the special court. And Fambul Tok's trust was based on the fact that you testify in front of your community, it's a non-judicial process, you won't get prosecuted. And so he had wanted to testify to go back and apologize for his atrocities and wasn't able to because Fambul Tok worried that it would undermine its organizational credibility at that critical moment if he got prosecuted. 18 months later, the proceeds of the court had wound down enough, and Savage said, I have to do this. So he did go back and apologize, and his community accepted his apology. Like, they accepted the apology of this notorious commander. It was a process. And it was, it took place in an arena where the community could come together to talk through these things. So it was helping the community heal. And he committed to going back and did go back and live in that community again to just be available to deal with the other issues that came up. And if you haven't read the book, he actually came onto the Fambul Tok staff and led a process working with other ex-combatants to help them come to terms with what they had done in the war. So there's a huge potential for receptivity to it in everything that I have seen. And I don't mean that as a blanket statement that it's always possible or would always be possible. I think every circumstance is different. And I think we had the unique, it was a gift in a way that we were coming in after the special court and the TRC, I would say. My colleague John might answer that differently.
Actually, could you continue a little more with that story? Because it ties into what I wanted to, because another thing that, is it Mohammed Savage? Am I getting?
Mohammed Savage, yeah.
Yeah, that he did then was, again, a lot of kind of low level work. You know, he didn't want to be a commander. He was willing to just do the work, and his work then with other ex-combatants was incredibly moving, and really did illuminate that the ex-combatants were hurting as well. You know, they were broken. It's not, the line between victim perpetrator was, it wasn't so clear. Can you speak a little more about that part of his work and his story and where that
So one of the, we made a film about this, as I was saying, and the feature film ends with Mohammed Savage, first of all, having come around from not acknowledging who he was to acknowledging it and saying he wants to forgive, to apologize, and not being able to go back because of the legacies of the special court. 18 months later, that changed. He was able to testify, to go back and apologize, and we filmed that, and that became the epilogue to the film. And then we made an educational version of the film where we incorporated the epilogue, so his apology story, in with the material from the feature film, and did so. It's all his story, and his reconciliation is a part of this shorter educational version. And we made a Creole voiceover version of that, so that it would be in the language that everybody in Sierra Leone, not everybody speaks, most people will speak Creole, even if it's not their main language, if they speak their tribal language. And so one of the things that, Mohammed Savage was so convicted that he had to reclaim his life, and he had to reclaim his life by recognizing that he, as a person, was not the person who committed all those atrocities. He had to take responsibility for it, but prove that that wasn't who he was. And that was just a really fundamental impulse for him. Around one of the national elections where there was a threat to violence, one of the things that happens in Sierra Leone is the ex-combatants all live in a lot of the same areas. And there's a lot of weapons floating around, and the political parties will oftentimes mobilize the ex-combatants during an election time to go foment violence on behalf of their political party. So they're like this, they get used by the politicians all the time. And Mohammed Savage was approached all the time. And they're armed and trained internationally, and it's so these are festering wounds still in the country. And he really wanted to work with the other ex-combatants to prevent election violence. And he was the perfect person to do that. So we did and this is one of the things I read about in the book, we did a film screening where he gathered ex-combatants. We thought there would be about 30, and there ended up being over 60 that came. And we showed the film, and then he facilitated with John. So it's his story. He's watching his story on, with all these ex-combatants, and then and then he's facilitating the session afterwards. One of the things that stood out to me was in the description that we went around at the beginning, why did you come? What everybody said was, like, literally one of the quotes was, I want to be a good somebody. And there's this sense of, I am nothing without my community. Like, literally, that's their understanding of identity, is that if I am separate from my community, I don't have my identity. And so this motivation to be a contributing member of, Hobbesian theory would have us believe that the most fundamental impulse is, get what you want, get what you can. And this is the thing, and it's not that that's not there. Like the evil, the atrocities are horrendous. There's no escape from that. And at the same time, what was so clear to me is that this impulse to be a contributing member of the community was fundamental. It was so strong. Like, that was this impulse. I want to be a contributing member. I want to be and they would do hard work to be able to reclaim that. And I think there's so much for us to learn from that. Again, I keep coming back to this. There's so much more good possible than I think we can even imagine. How do we create the circumstances that allow us to see that, to recognize, to invite it? You have to be clear-eyed. I'm not, again, saying don't be clear-eyed about this, but my gosh, it's humbling. It's humbling. Yeah, and so Mohammed Savage, in part, to help him be safe from the politicians, wanted to work in the Fambul Tok office. And when there wasn't money available for him to do more work with the ex-combatants, he was like, that's fine, I'll just show up, and did office errands, swept, cleaned toilets, went and picked up staff members' lunches for them, washed the cars when they came back from the road. I mean, menial jobs. And he had been one of the most senior commanders in the army and notorious rebel leaders, right? Like, so it's still astonishing.
Yeah, thanks. I think one thing that many of us involved in peace work, we know very well the horrible things that people can do.
Yeah.
And we look at that a lot. And what seems to me is that sometimes we're not sure we actually believe peace is possible.
Yeah.
And that reestablishing that, looking at these stories too, to understand why we're working for this, because it's in us. Actually, we read this book in our book group over the Winter Dignity by Donna Hicks. I'm not sure if you know her work. I would think so. You use dignity, the idea of restoring dignity comes up a lot in your book.
Yeah.
And, that understanding of each person as having that inherent dignity and wishing to actually live from that and treat each other that way is really fundamental. And that we get off track clearly happens. But the more we can help each other and hold each other and provide the space, the context for bringing that out, it's there.
Yeah.
And that, I think, really shone through in your book. We only have a few minutes. I would like to hopefully, this is a big question I'm going to ask you to do quickly, but the other thread through it was how, as an organizer, and an activist, you learned a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I loved was, how you were working to learn how not to do it alone. You, in fact, identified needing others as a strength and a skill.
Yeah.
And that vulnerability was part of what you wanted to bring instead of fight against.
Yeah.
Can you say a few words before we end about that? Because I think it's a great lesson for all of those engaged in this work.
Yeah.
In one, place or one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say first, my willingness to go it alone at certain ways was a strength. The way that we were working, I remember actually when I first met John, and he shared the vision that then became Fambul Tok of doing this national process that was locally led. And I was like, great, let's do it. And he's like, it's never been done this way before. And my response was, good. Why would we want to do something that's already been done? And we were working against the way it had been done in the past. And there's actually you got to be comfortable going it alone. You got to be comfortable. And we were meeting a ton of success and also significant support. But there were a lot of ways we had to protect it from outside influence. And that takes an ability to have good walls at some level, right? So those qualities have been good. And one of the things, and to tell people, no, we're not going to do it that way. No, we're not going to do it that way. No, we're not going to do it that way. Be willing to be different from everybody else is a really important quality. And at a certain point, my experience was I poured everything into this, our financial resources, my time, my energy, my heart, my everything. And it was like I had poured the pitcher out. I had nothing left. We had a significant change in the way we were organizing, and it left me just totally uncertain how to go forward. I had cultivated, I would say at that point, a network of individual mentoring relationships. I had a leadership coach that I worked with, different kinds of spiritual support, really strong one-on-one relationships, and it was not enough for me. And I realized I had been the bowl holder holding the bowl to grow this work in Sierra Leone, and I had never been in the middle of the bowl and had a space held for me. And at a certain point when literally, I don't think I could have gone on. I had no idea what we were supposed to do as Catalyst for Peace. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I was depleted. I convened a gathering that when I came to call my wisdom circle, of these trusted individuals. And one of the things I asked them to do was to reflect on what was unique about me as a person, me as a person. This is against every instinct that I had and had been raised with, all my, religious perspectives on the importance of humility and not drawing attention to myself, not wanting to be the white outsider drawing attention to like all of those things. But I had to create a space where I could receive from others the kind of mirroring back of my strengths, of my capacity, of our potential, of this way of working, in order to be able to continue to give. And that initiated, it was an incredibly powerful experience, incredibly humbling, physically the most difficult. Like after having spent an afternoon hearing people report back on the things that they actually appreciated about me, about our organization, about the way we were working, I was physically in pain. Like I literally couldn't stand up in my chair. Receiving that much good, I had no muscles for it, like literally, and I could hardly breathe. I physically couldn't hold it. And that began to change, and I began to claim that space and claim that support and justify using financial resources in support of bringing those people together for me, which was, this wasn't money that I had earned. I had gotten this money because my dad was a sound businessman and happened to put some of his business stock in my name. So I had this huge sense of responsibility to steward it well. And so to use some of it to support me as a person was, and ultimately, that's what I learned. It's like me, one of the things I saw is my weakness, actually, my need became the place where I could invite somebody else to give their gift. It became a channel for somebody offering their gift. So it became a strengthener of the whole because it created spaces for others to offer their gifts. And I saw that institutionally too. When there were things that we felt needed to happen that we couldn't fund, I felt awful. It felt like I was ruining the program. And inevitably, it would turn out that we were better off that we couldn't have done that. It didn't need to happen then. Or somebody else came in and had that resource and did it better than I could have, we could have, right? So institutionally, it worked that way too. And as we've pulled back, we're not granting to Fambul Tok anymore, and we're not even granting to support the government, the national framework process anymore, or the international support network. We've stepped back in ways that have created spaces for others to come in, and that's how you build community. I had to build it for me. We've had to build it organizationally. We've had to build it for the program. And so it's when you're willing to be present in your vulnerability and in your need, which is really hard to do. So the lesson for me was that ultimately we can only give to the degree that we're actually willing to receive and able to receive. And I think one of the things that I found in myself as somebody who's a social change activist, it's so much easier to give than it is to receive. And there's power dynamics at work there. There's control. That's neocolonialism. And so being present in my need is actually sometimes the most resourcing thing I can do, even as it's hard for me. And that's something that I'm still working to, unlearn or relearn.
Thank you. That's really beautiful. And actually, I think ties into what Meg was saying earlier about coming from cultures that are so individualistic, that having to relearn that we're in a community and we're supposed to lean on each other.
Yeah.
And that is actually a strength, is really, I think, a lovely note to end on. I'd love you to say here, I put it in the chat, but for those who might, can you say how we can get see what you're doing, what's your website and.
Yeah. So actually, I have an author website, which is libbyhoffman.com. And we're updating that more with the events, like, whenever I'm doing an event or news, like recent news around the book. And we were the Independent Book Publishers Association, just if I can brag one moment, is The Answers Are There is the most awarded book in the Independent Book Publishers Association.
Yay.
That the final awards will be
Can I
announced
see that again?
beginning of May. I'm sorry.
Can I see that again? I had to cough and also I had to put my phone down and okay, let me take it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the answers are there. So libbyhoffman.com is the author website. And catalystforpeace.org is our organization website. On libbyhoffman.com, we have links to Catalyst. We have links to the various Fambul Tok films and the feature films and different short films we've made. We have other resources all linked from there. The films are available free for streaming on Vimeo. So if you haven't seen them, I encourage you to do that. But this is available online and everywhere, a lot of local bookstores. If it's not in yours, go to your local bookstore, have them order it on Amazon, leave a review, wherever you like to order your books, also Audible and the Kindle or any ebook, any Audible platform, all available. And I did the narration on the Audible.
Yes.
So
Great. And I will say for New Hampshire Peace Action that we have lots more programming coming up and would love to see you there. And I did put that link in the chat, New Hampshire Peace Action is it org? Well, .org. Yeah, that's good enough. Then you can go to events or donate or whatever you'd like to do to engage with us. We're happy to have you. And now I just really want to thank Libby for taking this time, for inspiring me and others to read this book and learn about these possibilities, help us imagine new ways of moving forward. We so appreciate it. And this obviously conversation could have gone on and on. So there's so much here and I'm just really grateful. So everyone, if you could visibly, help me thank her.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby. That was terrific. And thanks to Amy and everybody. It's a great conversation.
Thank you all for joining us. It was wonderful to have you here. I know a lot more people will watch it when we get it up on YouTube, and you can send your friends and coworkers and whoever to watch it. And it was especially lovely to have some faces and comments and people here with us for this part of it. So
Thank you all.
thank you, everyone. And